horribly. Like, seriously, it manifested itself in my life horribly. It was one of the reasons why I found myself in therapy to begin with. What's up, geeks? It's your guy Q here, aka JGTV, and we are back with another one, guys. And today we're talking about God over culture, therapy, right? So we're still in therapy, but today we're gonna focus on trauma. So let's get right into it. So what exactly is trauma, right? Well, here's one definition we have. Trauma is a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress or physical injury. Thank you, Merriam-Webster. So that's one definition we have for trauma. When I first started talking about trauma in therapy, you guys can go back to my last video where I first started talking about God over culture and therapy, right? What does culture say? What does God say about therapy? So far, I've done a small introduction about my experiences with therapy and childhood and what I've seen thus far. This video, before we jump really into statistics and the Bible verses, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit more about the trauma aspect of therapy, right? What I learned about trauma while in therapy. So when I first started talking about trauma with my therapist, I was completely unaware. It was confusing, you know. I was like, what exactly is it? You know, like, sure, I had heard of like PTSD and things like that, and if someone hits their head, or I guess something traumatizing happens to someone, but I didn't exactly understand what trauma was. I noticed that when we were talking about my life specifically, certain events were important. Like, we kind of zeroed in on it. And this is where I began to realize that, oh, trauma is not just one main event. Trauma could be a lot of micro aggressive events that take place. Meaning small things, right? Like, sure, it could be someone experienced something horrible, like being shot and surviving it, right? Being stabbed and surviving it. Even some type of sexual assault, God forbid, and surviving it, right? But it can also be a child who has parents that call them ugly every day. A child who has parents who yell at them every day. A child who has parents who never encourage them, but most of the time they're being condescending and talking down to them. These are all microaggressive small events that lead to big event trauma, right? That ultimately affect us as we grow up and we become adults, and we have to actually go out in the world and have relationships and be normal people, right? So what exactly did all this mean? Well, nothing at first, at least that's what I thought, right? Then I learned about constantly having your nervous system activated. I learned about fight or flight, and I was just blown away by all of this. It was like I stepped into another world, and I was bamboozled. Like, I felt like I had been lied to or something. It was weird because all of these things I was finding out, and things that I thought were so normal for me to go through or for someone in my culture to experience, I realized that it was actually trauma, right? And a lot of the times, like I said in my last video, in my culture, we have to keep on going on. You know, we have to keep on keeping on. We have to be strong. You know, we don't need all of that. And God made us this way, and we're strong people, and we're built differently. It's just like, dude, people are still committing suicide and killing themselves. You know, people are still like hanging themselves. People are still like overdosing on drugs. Like, there's a problem. And I really, after spending time in therapy and actually sticking with it, I really feel like it's a lot of it is unresolved trauma. You know, I listened to a great podcast that someone referred to me, Brene Brown's podcast, and she had Oprah Winfrey on there and the doctor who she just wrote her recent book with called What Happened to You, and they were discussing trauma, and it was just amazing some of the things that they were talking about, right? I mean, this stuff is harmful to anyone. It doesn't matter if you're black, if you're white, if you're Chinese, if you come from India. This kind of stuff is harmful to anyone. Anyone's parents constantly calling them ugly or being condescending to them is trauma, right? That's traumatic. Anyone experience any type of like physical trauma to them, whether it be sexual assault or violent trauma, like, it's traumatic. You know what I mean? And this stuff affects us. We can't just sweep this stuff under the rug and say, oh, you know, well, that happened and I have to grow up, I have to get over it. No, like, this is stuff that manifests itself in your life later on as you get older. And this is what I learned personally. Like, I learned why I reacted to things the way I was reacting, why I thought things the way I thought them and when I thought them, and the whole process that led up to me thinking them. All of this stuff started to make sense when I learned about trauma, right? And I think that this is important to all people, but especially people in the black community, because I've had numerous conversations with friends about this, and this is not something that was talked about in any of our households. I can count on one hand how many times I heard trauma. You know how many times it was? This many times. That's how many times I heard the word trauma at my house. And I probably heard therapy once or the same amount of times. So this stuff is important because this is harmful to anyone, to all of us. And it manifests itself in our lives later as we grow up. Later as we become social and we get into relationships and romantic relationships and we go to school and we have jobs, like, it manifests itself. This is why people get fired for blowing up on their boss, or one day going to work and like shooting the place up, which is horrible, like, because this stuff manifests itself, right? So how did all of this stuff manifest itself in my life? Horribly. Like, seriously, it manifested itself in my life horribly. It was one of the reasons why I found myself in therapy to begin with. And I had ample questions, like, why do I think this way? Why do I react to things this way? Why do I feel this way? Like, is this just normal? Is this a black thing? Is this an everyone thing? Like, what is this that I'm feeling? In therapy, learning about trauma is where I got my answers. And this is why I holistically, and I promote this, I stand by this. I feel like this is a great thing, it's a good thing, it's a godly thing for someone to go seek therapy, for everyone to go seek therapy. There is a test out there that you can take called the ACE test, and it asks you 10 questions relating to some, I would say, pretty traumatic experiences that you may have gone through. The funny thing about the ACE test is that statistically speaking, about 61% almost has scored at least a 1 on the ACE test. And some of these questions they ask you are pretty traumatic. So needless to say, my score was pretty high. My wife's score was pretty high, you know, and that's some transparency for you guys. But if you find that test, the ACE test about childhood trauma, I mean, and you answer those questions and you see your score, it already says that if you get an ACE test score of 4 or higher, you're in danger of all kinds of diseases. It blew my mind when I read this. I'm probably gonna leave a link for that in the next video when I get a little bit more into the statistics about trauma. But right now, I just wanted to kind of talk to you guys a little bit more about how I learned about and what I learned about trauma while in therapy, and why I feel like therapy is still so good, because it teaches you about trauma, and it's not something that is talked about, not in churches, not in many communities, not really at all, right? So is there trauma in the Bible, right? Of course there is. Of course there is. And that's what I'm going to be bringing to you guys next. But Not before I bring you some statistics. So stay tuned for that video next, right? God over culture, therapy. I'm going to bring you guys some statistics about therapy and trauma. And then we're going to get into some Bible. There's trauma all over the Bible. That thing is traumatic, dramatic. It is some drama in there for your mama. It is some drama in the Bible, and we're going to get into it. So I hope you guys got something from this. I'm enjoying this thing. I love talking about therapy and trauma. So stay tuned, guys. This is going to be good. What do I always say? Love yourselves, love one another, but most of all, love God. Peace.